Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And this is the latest in the series of episodes I am recording while I am out on the road. Hopefully, you are all having a wonderful week while I am out. And hopefully, this still gives you a chance to come together, hang out, chat, and talk a little football in the mornings, even without me here to be interacting with you live. But please keep in mind, this is all stuff that I am doing to just keep this group going, keep the conversation going, keep the community growing. And every time you click like or subscribe to the channel, it is something that is a nice, simple way that you can express some gratitude, and it means a lot. So I appreciate it if you could take a moment, click like, click subscribe, and we will get into the football stuff here in a second. So what I wanted to talk about in this, what will be a pretty brief episode today, but there's something that I just find to be underrepresented in discussions about what it takes to win a Super Bowl. And it's going to sound very obvious, and that's fine, but I want to use a few of local examples to really bring this concept to life. And the concept is that I have been struck by just how large a percentage of the chances of a team winning a Super Bowl ring has to do with luck. Pure and simple, good fortune, things going your way when they could have gone a million other ways. And you might say, of course, I mean, obviously there's luck involved in any sport, in any game, and that would be true. But I think when you go back and you look at, if I was to ask you, what's the difference between the 2013 Seahawks and the 2015 Seahawks, or the 2004 Seahawks and the 2005 Seahawks, or the 2005 Seahawks and the 2013 Seahawks, I think you would start with a million other things about who was playing quarterback, or someone had a good year that year, or something about the game itself. And what would probably be last on that list is just good fortune. And so what I wanted to do to kind of illustrate the things that come to mind for me when I think about just how important luck is to actually go through a little bit about the 2005 and 2013 season when the Seahawks made the Super Bowl. And we'll talk probably about the 2014 season as well, and just how many things went right for the Seahawks to get where they ended up going. And eventually, in some cases, what went wrong that kept them from getting to the final place that they wanted to be standing on top of that stage at the end of the season. So I think we'll start with the 2005 season. And this is a season that, I mean, that team was so strong. And I think people forget just how strong that Seahawks team was because they didn't end up winning a Super Bowl. In fact, the game wasn't that close in the Super Bowl. And I think that overshadowed what was a very good year and a very good team. That Seahawks team was second in the NFL that year in point differential, plus 181. You want to guess who was number one that year in point differential? It was not the Pittsburgh Steelers, the team they played in the Super Bowl. It was the Indianapolis Colts, who were at 192 was their differential. But the Seahawks were by far the highest in the NFC. The next closest in the NFC was actually the Carolina Panthers, who we'll talk about in a second. But as you kind of go through that Seahawks season, there's a couple things that stand out. And in terms of good fortune, that Seahawks team, as good as it was, played in the worst division in the NFL. None of the other teams were 500 that year in that division, and none of them were particularly close. The St. Louis Rams, St. Louis at the time, were 6-10. The Arizona Cardinals were 5-11, and those lovable 49ers were 4-12. God bless them. So the Seahawks just blew through their division, for the most part. They really did not have a ton of challenge in facing those teams. The one exception to that, they did have a couple of close divisional games. They were beat the Rams 37-31 in St. Louis, and they beat the 49ers 27-25 in San Francisco. So those were, the tight games in the division. But for the most part, this team had it very easy with 6 out of their 16 games. That is not the case with obviously this year's Seahawks team or last year's Seahawks team. It also happened to be the case for a lot of the Patriots teams over Tom Brady and Bill Belichick's careers. Historically bad division for better part of 20 years, really. So again, I don't think most people think, oh man, that Seahawks team made it to the Super Bowl because they had a crappy division, but it absolutely played a role. And if they had a much tougher division and had to travel, who knows what would have happened and whether that would have been different. But the Seahawks were 8-0 at home. They were undefeated at home. They were 5-3 away. They did lose on the road. Now, one of those losses was the last game of the season against the Packers when they weren't really playing their starters, and they basically just had Sean Alexander in there to make sure that he recorded the rushing title. But um, it was not as strong of a team on the road. And that home field advantage was a huge part of what took them to the Super Bowl. And, if they had had a couple of divisional losses, then they very well could have been on the road, traveling to one of these other teams for a game. So that's one bit of luck related to the 2005 Seahawks. As you go through that season, there were some really remarkable moments that were quite fortunate. So, one of them that comes to mind, um, uh, is the game against Dallas, the Cowboys. This was a game at home. This was a game that the Seahawks won 13-10, but they were down 10-3 uh, with 2 minutes to go in this game. Very little. Their win probability was quite low at that point, and it was a 81-yard drive in 1 minute and 15 seconds that tied that game at 10-10. And then you'll remember this, those of you who are old enough to. Um, the Cowboys actually went for, were trying to get a field goal to win, but ultimately, big play Jordan Babineau intercepted the pass, and that led to a Josh Brown 50-yard field goal to win it. And so, that was a game that really kind of helped the Seahawks believe that they were going to be the team that they hoped to be. It, was their third straight win at that point, and was against a team that had a lot of, a lot of belief across the league that they were going to be one of the better teams, and the Seahawks were able to beat them in that game. And I mean, the interception by Babineau, that was one of the most unlikely wins I remember seeing. As that season kind of wore on, one of the other things that ended up happening from a good fortune standpoint is, if you look at the injury situation, and this will be a theme that we'll come back to a couple of times, that was a very healthy team. So if I go back and I look at the Seahawks injury situation for um, for 2005, I guess I can't. They don't have it here. Um, Let me look real quick. I think I could probably find injured reserve. Seahawks injuries 2005. Let's see. Um so Do they have it here anywhere? I'm looking. So, um, gosh, why don't they have injury information for all the way back then? Let me take one other look and see if I can find that information. So, um, obviously, Matt Hasselbeck never got injured. Um, Sean Alexander never got injured. Uh, Walter Jones, Steve Hutchinson never got injured. These are the players that really made the big difference. But there was one bit of injury. This is the part of the injury news I was trying to remember. Um, for those that don't, there was the Ken Hamlin moment. So Ken Hamlin was there before there was Cam Chancellor, there was Ken Hamlin. And Ken Hamlin was a absolute badass safety, big hitter, and he was involved with an off-field incident where he actually got hit by a street sign and had a head injury that ended up leaving him out for the rest of the season. And that was not a deep defense. And so in came Marquand Manuel, who was, basically nobody at that point. And the fact that he was able to fill in and be a competent safety was a big part of how that team was able to um, survive that injury. Um, checking through to see other things, to see if I can find any other injury information. Let's see. This was IR. Here we go. Yeah, Ken Hamlin was really the only notable player that went on the IR. Alex Bannister also went on the IR, but I don't think that was a game-changing kind of thing. So, but where injuries did creep up. So before I kind of finish the injury conversation, I'll interject the other bit of good fortune for that Seahawks team in 2005. So they played Washington at home. This was their first playoff. This is the first time the Seahawks had a playoff win in like 20 something years. It had been a huge drought for the Seahawks. And one of the things that happened in that first game was, if you don't remember, Sean Alexander did get injured in that game. He got a concussion. He only had 6 carries for 9 yards. And so the Seahawks really ended up having to eke one out against a pretty clearly inferior, what was at the time, the Redskins team. And they made it through. It was kind of like breaking the seal. Once they had done that, then they played much better. But they had a very, very favorable path to the Super Bowl. So Washington was not that great of a team. And then they faced Carolina. And Carolina that year was not expected to make it, but they went in and beat a Chicago team in the divisional round that had one of the best defenses in the league at that point. So let's go ahead and pull up that Bears team. So let's pull up the 2005. Yeah, that Bears team led the NFL in yards per play. They absolutely dominated in points against. That team was 11-5, first place in the NFC North. They only allowed 12.6 points per game, and were number 1 in points against, number 2 in yards against, number 6 in turnovers forced, number 1 in passing touchdowns against. So this was like a very formidable defense that was led, I believe, by Brian Urlacher at this point. Yeah, Brian Urlacher, Lance Briggs, if you remember him, Peanut Tillman, Mike Brown, Adewale Agunlie. They had a lot of guys. Tommy Harris. They had quite a few really talented players on that defense. That would have been a much harder game for the Seahawks, but the Panthers upset the Bears in Chicago, and they walked into Seattle and just got blown off the field. I mean, almost any team I feel like would have had a really hard time winning in Seattle on that day. Having been in the stadium, it was crazy, but Carolina just it was like a hot knife through butter, or like a finger through wet tissue paper. I mean, it was really, there was no resistance once that game really got going and Lofa Tatupa got his interception. So again, their path to the Super Bowl was quite easy, all things considered. Um, and that is just luck. That is just luck. And honestly, they were pretty lucky by who they faced in the Super Bowl. The luck continued because the Steelers weren't expected to be there. The Colts, as I mentioned, were the number one team from a point differential standpoint. This was the Peyton Manning Colt, the Dwight Freeney, the Marvin Harris. Like, this was a very good Colts team. And the Steelers managed to go from wild card to the Super Bowl with I think it was a rookie quarterback at that time in Ben Roethlisberger, and just kind of came out of nowhere. And so that should have been a huge advantage. Actually, it was his second season, not his rookie season. That the Seahawks got to play the Steelers in the Super Bowl. And in fact, I think the outcome would have been different, except for getting back to luck on the other side of the ledger. On the injury side, their luck ran out in the Super Bowl. And we'll talk about this because this has happened more than once to the Seahawks, unfortunately. But you remember Ken Hamlin got hurt, so then they had Marquand Manuel. But then in that game, they lost multiple players to injury. So Marquand Manuel was one of the players that went out with injury. And I'm trying to see if I can find all the other players that were out that during that game. Let me pull up. I'll remember because I'll just look at the names of players. I know one of the defensive linemen went out. I think it was Rocky Bernard. I think he pulled a hamstring trying to run after somebody on a fumble or interception return. But the big one was Marquand Manuel, and the Seahawks had to put in Ettrick Pruitt. Once the Seahawks put in Ettrick Pruitt, all of a sudden there were blown assignments. There were trick plays for touchdowns. They couldn't tackle. It was just everything went to pot. And so, again, injury luck ran out at the most inopportune time. And then, as we all know, additionally, because it's happened, it's been publicized, they had officials blow some really critical calls, bad enough that the lead official for that game came out years later and apologized to the Seahawks and apologized for what he felt like was calls that kept the team from winning a game that they should have won. I mean, none of that has to do with how good you are. Why am I focusing on luck? Why am I bringing this up? Well, because there is so much that you have to build up beyond the talent on your roster in order to win a ring. It is not enough to be the most talented team. Look at the 49ers, right? And if I switch from the Seahawks for a moment, look at the Rams. The Rams had a very talented roster, but had they not been facing the Bengals in that Super Bowl, they wouldn't have won. They would not have beaten the Mahomes-led Chiefs. They would not have beaten the Allen-led Bills. I don't believe in that Super Bowl. And they barely beat the Burrow-led Bengals. That was very, very lucky for them that they had, and it happened to be also in their home stadium. I mean, very good luck. If the 49ers, either of the 49ers teams that have made it, had faced that Bengals team instead of the Chiefs twice, then I don't think that they would still be without a ring, to be very honest. So I'm very thankful that the luck worked out in our favor there. But even just who you match up with, where you play, what the weather is, all these things are outside of your control. And it's part of what makes ultimately winning so special and so rewarding is so many things have to go your direction. So that was a 2005 team. There's more I could kind of talk about there, but you kind of get the point, right? Like generally healthy, their best players stayed healthy for most of the season, ended up in the Super Bowl not being the case. Easiest division in football. A lot of things just kind of came together and they were very good and they were very talented, well coached, had the best run game, had the MVP, like a lot of things, had a career season from a lot of guys that year. So that's the 2005 team. The 2013 team, as we talk about them, I think that team's really fascinating because everyone's just like, that's the best team ever. It's like stacked. That team barely, barely made it to the Super Bowl. I mean, by the tip of Richard Sherman's fingers, made it to the Super Bowl that season. And that's a perfect example of the opposite kind of luck. The Seahawks played in one of, if not the strongest divisions in football in 2013. The 49ers, the Seahawks were 13-3. The 49ers were 12-4. The Arizona Cardinals were 10-6. So, and even the Rams were 7-9. So this was not a cakewalk division by any stretch. In fact, the Seahawks dropped 2 of their 3 losses were in the division. People don't probably remember, but they lost to the Arizona Cardinals 17-10 at home. Russell threw a bunch of interceptions. This was the second to last week of the season. They lost to the 49ers 19-17 in San Francisco. So the division was not easy. And the other part of this is there were some crazy things that, like from an injury standpoint, that team went through. And it's not even all, I don't think injuries fully captures it. But keep in mind, let's see. I think this was that season. Double checking. So yeah. So this was actually, I'm forgetting. I think it was the year prior. Never mind. I'll save that for another conversation. But um, that team from an injury situation, uh, they had on the offensive line. People forget. People remember. Well, people remember the game against Houston, the massive overtime. Richard Sherman winning it with, a interception return in his sock, essentially. I mean, that tied it, and then they kicked a field goal in overtime to win it. But what people forget about that game is that they were missing a significant chunk of their offensive line, and they forget that a lot of the players on that line were out for a lot of the season. So Russell Okung, for example, he was out from week 3 all the way for, what was it, for 8 games. Russell Okung missed half of that season. Um, uh, Breno Giacomini missed 7 games, 6 games, and they happened to overlap. So the Seahawks played a number of games without their left and their right starting tackle. And that's not, I mean, that is a bad luck thing. So again, you don't have to have good luck in all cases here. I'm just saying that's a bad luck thing. But what that meant was there were players on that roster that ended up getting snaps and being part of what ultimately was that big game against the 49ers. Who am I talking about? I am talking about uh, Alvin Bailey, So let me pull up. I'm trying to pull up the roster there and make sure I got the right numbers. So where is he? Alvin Bailey. Yes. So Alvin Bailey in that game in that year, he was a rookie that year. He ended up playing a number of snaps during the season, and what ended up then happening is he gained a lot of confidence and became a larger part of the team. And people don't remember this, but Seahawks were down to the 49ers in the championship game, the NFC championship game at halftime. And they came out at halftime with a heavy formation with Alvin Bailey playing an extra eligible lineman, and they ran the ball down the 49ers' throats with Marshawn Lynch. I don't know that Alvin Bailey, who was a rookie that year, would have been ready to play in a game of that caliber had they not had been able to have those injuries and have him on the field earlier in the season. And these are kind of these like secret hidden things that happen along the way that kind of help teams become what they are. Um, other pieces there from a injury perspective. People remember Percy Harvin missed pretty much that entire year. He was healthy enough to make it into the Super Bowl and had a huge role to play in that Super Bowl, not only on offense on the first series, but on the kickoff return that sealed the deal. Um, there's no guarantee that was going to happen, but it did. Uh, Other guys, you know, Sidney Rice ended up going on the IR that year, missed most of that season. It allowed players like Jermaine Kearse, and Golden Tate and Doug Baldwin to accelerate into what would be their kind of coming out party years. So different little pieces there that kind of went on with that team, and ultimately, when they went to play that Super Bowl, they had everybody that they really could possibly want to have healthy and ready to play. They had played their toughest opponent already in the 49ers, and so when they got to play the Broncos, it was a cakewalk compared to the level of competition that they had faced. So you can kind of argue it both ways, whether it's good or bad fortune to have tough competition on your way to the playoffs and to the Super Bowl. But I think in the case of a team like that 2013 Seahawks squad, it was absolutely good fortune that they were able to prove themselves and gain the absolute ferocity and confidence they had by playing and beating teams that were much tougher than the one that they faced in the Super Bowl. Um, I had thought that was the year that Richard Sherman and Brandon Browner were suspended for a drug violation, but that was the year prior, and that was also kind of crazy luck. Richard Sherman ended up beating that rap, and that is pretty fortunate. You don't see that happen ever, but it happened with Sherm. But that was not the 2013 season. You fast forward to the 2014 season, and again, some similarities there. I mean, I don't have to remind anybody what happened in the 2014 uh, NFC Championship game, but that was a absolutely incredibly good fortune that the Seahawks were able to win the most unlikely comeback maybe in playoff history, or at least it's close to it, against the Packers at home. Um, and then when they got to the championship game, to the Super Bowl against the Patriots, you could argue bad fortune, good fortune there. The bad luck is the Patriots were even there. Um, Much tougher opponent. The Patriots managed to beat the Ravens at home. It took a last minute game-winning touchdown drive by Tom Brady to do it. The Ravens had been ahead late in the fourth quarter of that game. They didn't make it. Then there was Deflategate with the Colts, and while everyone makes such a big deal of that, I mean, it was 17-7 at halftime in favor of the Patriots. They ended up winning 45-7. I don't think the balls could have been, they could have been halfway inflated or 120% inflated or perfectly inflated, and they still would have lost. So I don't consider that a luck thing. But in any event, they played the Patriots, and then you have a game there where the Seahawks were set to win that game until you had what? Injuries again. You had Cliff Averill go down. You had Cam Chancellor get injured prior to the game even starting. You had Richard Sherman playing with a shoulder that needed to be operated on after that game because he was hurt in the Packer game. Earl Thomas was hurt coming into that game. And then you lost Jeremy Lane. He got hurt on an interception in that game. So once all of those things happened, the tide turned. The Patriots were able to rally in the fourth quarter and take the lead. And the Seahawks still almost won that game and should have won that game, as we all know. But had they been playing any other team, any other coach, and maybe any other cornerback, I don't know that interception happens at the 1 yard line. So, you know, does that mean that the Seahawks were not as good of a team as the 2013 squad? No. In a lot of ways, the 2014 squad was better than the 2013 squad, especially on offense. That was the other thing. They were missing receivers in that game. People forget because we had all of those guys available during the season, but for the Super Bowl, I'm just double checking. Yeah, Brandon Mebane was out, by the way. I forgot that he was on IR at the end of that year. But Paul Richardson was put on IR after the first game of the playoffs. So they're missing Paul Richardson. And there's another receiver that they were missing. I'm blanking. But in any event, they were thin at the receiver position, and had to really rely on Chris Matthews in that game to play a big role as receiver. But in any event, like, there was a lot of bad luck that piled up to make that team lose by the slightest of margins in the unlikeliest of ways. And so you can get all the way up to literally the 1 yard line, literally the last minute of the season, and luck plays such a big role. That was a football play, but it's still like the luck involved there. The fact that Marshawn Lynch got tripped, right before he was going to score on that earlier play. The fact that Pete Carroll had to burn it. I won't go into that play in particular, but there's so many factors outside of just purely who's the better team that led to that ultimate result. And really, I think a lot of it just gets back to injuries. And so part of what made that LOB era team so good is that they could withstand. They had such depth and such talent and such strength in certain places that they could withstand bad luck. They could withstand bad calls. They could withstand, long stretches of things not going their way, because ultimately they were a better team than the folks that they were opposing, and they also just believed in how good they were at that point. So when we're talking about this new Seahawks roster coming together, they're not anywhere close to being that talented, to being overwhelming in any one area of the game, let alone multiple areas like some of those other teams were. But what they do have in their favor is this is a young team, and young teams tend to be healthier, and young teams tend to, start to build that confidence in these areas as they, especially working with a new coach and a new scheme. And so I think that's going to be something that, you know, you hear Jeff and I kind of joke about it at times, but the pressure's off on these years because we're not really expected to win a ring. And when you're not expected to win a ring, you know, like last year when Abe Lucas and Charles Cross missed some time, that sucked. But it didn't really matter that much because, you know, it meant the Seahawks maybe didn't make the playoffs and didn't lose in the first round like they did the year before. But I don't know that that really matters in the grand scheme. But once this Seahawks team does get good enough to truly contend, then you'll need enough depth to be able to overcome injury situations. You'll need a clear strength. And this is what the other video that I shared just the other day, that it's not good enough to be the fifth best in something or the top five. You need to be the very best at some things. And so that's where, you know, as we're trying to watch, hopefully the next rise of the Seahawks, the next, you know, era of a very competitive contending team, we're going to need to see those strengths develop and some good fortune. Some of that might be, you know, well, maybe the 49ers, will they start to recede? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Will the Rams gain momentum as they seem to be doing and become, will this be essentially another 2013 kind of division where every game in the division is a hard one? I think the trend is more that way than it is towards the 2005 trend where you can just count on 6 wins on your schedule pretty much because it's going to be a cakewalk. I don't know if we'll ever have the good fortune of having 3 teams as bad as that 2005 team had in the division. So a lot of these different pieces come into play. I think the schedule that the Seahawks got for 2004 is an example of good fortune, and I think they are pretty lucky with what they have there. Let's see what they can do with that and what they can build on from there. All right, so that's just a quick conversation, a quick reminder, a quick stroll through memory lane. Some of it painful, I acknowledge, but just how much luck plays a role in whether your team actually wins the championship at the end, and that it's not just football. And that might be obvious, but like the percentage of any championship that has to do with luck is just, I think, a lot larger than anybody wants to acknowledge. All right, everybody. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. This has been another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. Take care.